let me ask you this, because we've actually spoken before. We spoke about 5 years ago, I think for Godspeed.
Yeah, I know.
And,
it's been a while.
Yeah, I know. It's what happens with time. It just evaporates.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the major changes in the world of independent films, particularly in that amount of time, has been this crowdfunding craze.
Yes.
Of which you were taking part for your new project, The Last Beat. So why did that feel like a good option for you with this particular project?
Yeah, so it's true. We feel like crowdfunding is sort of maturing a bit and becoming accepted and used, but also because, filmmakers kind of run out of options with the traditional sources of financing. We've been at this for about 3 years, and, we've had some, we got close to some money, and then it would go away, and basically found that the traditional ways of getting the film made, whether it's through private equity and kind of the sellableness of the film, the filmmaker, the cast, those elements are sort of just hard for a film like ours. A lot of people still see The Last Beat as a small art film, and maybe it is. I mean, we never did. We thought we had something really cool, something even more commercial than my last film, even, Godspeed, which was genre. But we thought this could reach a wider audience, and it was such a struggle to really prove that. And I think with crowdfunding, you can shoot some of your film, you can maybe have some stills. I feel like you can go right to the source of what your audience might be and really show them the film. But it's frightening for filmmakers, I think for me, maybe because I'm a little older now, because you kind of have to expose yourself a little bit with your project. I think we're so used to also making the film kind of in private, certainly showing it to people and showing the cut. But now you really have to sort of say, well, here's my process and here's the film, and hope that people like it before it's even done. So I think that's the scary part. But as we're in it now, going into the third week, we've raised about $31,000, and we kind of feel empowered, Jamie. We feel like it's been great to show. We've actually shot the first 9 minutes, getting some great reaction to it. We've done a lot of stills, key art. With this film, I think it's kind of easier and maybe more fun because it is a period piece and certainly based on real people. But it's been amazing to just show that to people. And like I said, it's kind of scary at first. But once you kind of get into that groove, I think it's, once again, like I said, empowering, and people do kind of show up, and it's your audience right there, no middleman. So I think that's
Yeah, that's so true. And these are people that obviously they love the world of independent film enough to invest their own money in it. And so it kind of strengthens that sense of community too. I think that it's a kind of a beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
But I always ask about crowdfunding because it does have it is kind of a double-edged sword. And then the negative publicity on it in recent years have been the really established filmmakers that have worked under the studios that are using it. Do you feel territorial about crowdfunding, or do you think it should be open to everyone?
I don't think I'm as territorial as some people. It's sometimes disheartening, I'll be honest, because we're sitting here struggling to raise what we can, and a celebrity could kind of come on, and there they are in 2 weeks, have more than 3 figures. But however, when someone like Spike Lee, who struggled to really get Red Hook Summer out, who still makes, I consider, art films, I still think, there needs to be a platform for that, because they're getting turned down for certain films they want to make. I know he can go out and make a bigger film, sure, but maybe he wants to do something more personal, and there is an audience for that, and it's not the studio film audience. Well, they think it's not. So I'm kind of torn, but I think when it's a filmmaker I really respect and know that actually comes from a place that is making, films, maybe not all the time, that aren't always in the studio world, I think they do deserve that support. And I'm kind of happy to have them there. And in some ways, it maybe helped us get some, get seen and heard too, right? It was like, okay, it's okay for you guys to be on crowdfunding. Before it was like, oh, sorry, last resort. Sorry, guys, maybe you suck. That's not true. There's lots of great filmmakers right now. Hal Hartley, I think is there. And he's certainly someone that this is perfect for someone like Hal Hartley, right? I mean,
sure, yeah.
It's hard for him to find money,
Well, I always said that I think the one, when he has said that he's wanted to make movies again, he said, well, the studio, I wouldn't be able to make movies under a studio, and that's David Lynch. I think if he used crowdfunding, that project would be financed in a heartbeat, whatever.
Right?
You want
Yeah, exactly. Right? Oh God, yeah, I'd be right there. Be the first one in line.
So tell me about The Last Beat. This is inspired by the last days of Jim Morrison?
That's correct. So it's a fictional take on really the final days of Morrison, and it's really what we want to do is delve into the psychology of who Jim might have been. You know, we're not talking about did he die in a bathtub, what were the actual facts, what was he holding in his hand the day before he died, and we're just not interested in that. It's really the mind of this man. You know, also perhaps, you know, what were his relationships like? We obviously have a woman in the film that's loosely based on Pamela Corson. We just really want to celebrate Jim as a poet as well and look into that. But also for me, it was a way of taking kind of a hybrid amalgamation of like Kerouac, James Dean, all these sort of American icons and writers, even like Henry Miller, into a character that certainly, 90% of it, I'll admit, you know, is comes from Morrison, but also the sense of like this character who's, I call it the American loneliness, you know, this sort of lost figure on a highway I'm obsessed with, I think, and we certainly start out the film with that, and it does references Morrison's own film we do with his friends called Highway or HWY, but I think we're taking these elements and fictionalizing them to I think a greater psychological truth. For me, a lot of biopics seem like pedestrian. I feel like they follow like the rules a little bit, and then you end up with no soul, and because you're just stuck with so-called facts. And you know, we're not trying to be just disrespectful. Of course not. The complete opposite. We think we're hopefully going to get deeper into the mind of this man and celebrate him even more as a writer by doing it this way.
That's a question I had. I had two questions for you about your goals with the film, and one was, how concerned are you with kind of demythologizing Morrison and the whole kind of rock god notion?
That is part of this, you know, in a sense, you know, in the first part of the film, like his girlfriend's throwing out his leather pants, but yet we start out with him wearing it. It's hard. I think I said something to Sean, who's playing Jay, like Jim couldn't even get rid of his own mythology. That was one of the reasons he was in Paris, and one of the reasons I think he, you know, kind of fell apart. He couldn't even escape his own, you know, thing he created in a way, or other people created around him, but he certainly was part of it. And I think that we want to demythologize in some way, but also admit that you can't completely. And to say that we can, I think would be dishonest as well.
Yeah. Well, it kind of, I'm sure at some time these figures, they embrace this kind of mythology that surrounds them, but then if they're really artists, I think they come to realize how much it can imprison them and their personal growth.
Absolutely. Exactly.
So my second question about your aims with this, you mentioned the standard musical biopic. Are you concerned with kind of genre deconstruction at all?
Interesting. In a way, there is music in the film, and the film is nonlinear in a sense. It's, you know, I really loved what Gus Van Sant did with Last Days, and this is definitely a different approach, but it is a sense of like, to me, just feels like a poem for a poet, for lack of a better word. So maybe it's not necessarily a complete narrative deconstruction, but it is, I think, maybe asking questions that biopics, you know, can't do, because you're just stuck in, to be honest, like, well, 3 people said this happened, and who knows what really happened? I mean, there's 3 people that aren't this person. And I feel like you run around in circles, and I'm almost dissatisfied, I feel like, with a biopic, even if it's nonlinear or does something interesting. I think the only one I really, really, really liked was the Glenn Gould one. I thought that was brilliant, you know. I think any biopic, too, has to really, particularly if they're about artists or writers, has to sort of come from that person's psychology or their art or reference it. You know, without that, then it's just completely lost. And it's certainly the poetry and the times that Morrison lived in is a big part of the film, and why I'm drawn to it in the first place, and why we want to get that back out to people, for those that were there and those that didn't live in the 60s or the 70s, of course. So maybe that's answering your question, but yeah.
No, I think that's all so incredibly valid, and I love what you said, because the one thing that I appreciate most about biopics of artists is when they're able to find the connection between the artist and their art, to kind of dramatize where the art comes from. And so few films can actually do that. And I ironically enough, I don't think Oliver Stone's Morrison biopic did that at all. I think the only thing that movie was successful at doing, really, for me, was kind of showing how he could become Morrison in that particular time period, how the atmosphere of the 60s and 70s would kind of allowed for him to flourish in that way.
In many ways I agree. And look, I love that film. I kind of grew up with that film. I was pretty young when that film came out, so it was kind of hard not to, love that film, and I'm a huge Morrison fan. So there it is. Of course I am. But then you kind of grow up a little bit, and you feel the same way. I'm like, where's the writer in this? I know he's in there, because I've read his poetry, and from actually the poetry of Morrison's poetry was really my first real way into him, less than the rock star. Look, I love the Doors, and I love his lyrics in the Doors, not all of which he wrote, of course, but it's just the poetry, which I found so many connections to Kerouac and to even Henry Miller, just like I said, this American loneliness. I don't know what it is. There's a mythology in Morrison's work that ties him to the great American writers for me. So when I was in college, when the film came out, I mean, that's what tied me to Morrison, less than the rock star, falling around drunk. And I think in terms of, the mythology, we're really trying to stay, look, he drinks in our film, I admit it. But it is, I'm glad you mentioned that. It really is us trying to find out where is this art coming from, and actually in our film, where did it go? Because he's not able to touch on it because he's become something else that's destroyed him. And that's really the tragedy of our character in our film, that his girlfriend, is really trying to encourage him to continue to write, and he's got nothing in his notebook. And he's in Paris, the place where you're supposed to go as an expatriate and write, and he has nothing left. He's already dead, or as we say in the film, he's already gone. And I think it's interesting. Sean and I are obsessed with that thing that you just said. Where is that point where the art, where the artist becomes, where the art and the artist merge? And I think that's one of the biggest reasons we wanted to make this film. And it is not the other Doors film. It's just our take on someone we really, really admire, and this person's a writer.
Well, your character, Jay Douglas, which is the inspired by Jim Morrison. Tell me, describe being a poet, Morrison and your character being poets. Describe their unique voice. How do you characterize their particular voice?
It's interesting. I think it's a voice that is, like Jim, caught between life and death. In a weird way, I know those are two big concepts, but there's something about Morrison that I love, which is he's almost this person who traveled for us into this really this area where we're afraid of, which yes, it's maybe where life ends, and it comes back with these crazy images and surreal vistas and highways. The highway is a big theme, and it for Jim and Kerouac obviously, and Jay is no different. And I think that they're looking for a peace of mind, but I think their mind is already gone. And because they have taken these journeys, I think with Jim, you really see it sometimes. Sometimes he's extremely lucid and intelligent, and sometimes like, whoa, where are you? Where have you traveled to? And when they brought back all this information for us, they tried to write it down, but it came out as poetry. Most people said, well, I don't know what that is. It's gibberish. But some of us go like, oh, this makes perfect sense. So I think that's where our character's coming from too, and it's absolutely, comes from Morrison's own take on I don't know, his journeys.
Well, and when I'm asking you about this, I'm asking both about the Morrison kind of Douglas hybrid that you're working on.
Yeah.
Because all great artists, no matter what avenue they explore through, they kind of expose truths about the people on the other end that are enjoying their art. But I'm always curious about how self-aware they are, how much they actually confront who they are. How you know? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I would think that Jim was in some ways. I think our character is, and they were both scared, just way more scared than we ever thought right at the end. I personally think that Jim kind of knew that Paris was it. And our character, I wrote Jim sort of in that, I'm sorry, Jay, in that fashion as well. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Jay, who said that? Jay is scared, terribly scared. And no amount of eroticism, there's definitely like sex in the film, but like he can't be saved anymore by this world. And that's a very scary thing. So I think he's self-aware when he's writing in a weird way, but it's still metaphors, you know, it's still comforting, soothing. But when he really has to face it, when you kind of know it's close, I think you become a little child again, and you don't know what to do. You flail, you fight against it like everyone would, and you kind of don't know how to speak about it. And I think our character, that's what's happened with Jay, you know? Yeah, but there's acceptance in the end, I think, for him, and I think there was for Jim. And it sounds kind of dark, but I think that self-awareness becomes confusion, and then acceptance. You know, maybe like those 5 stages. I don't know, but I think that's what's at least happening in our film. So
it's so odd because you know, I'm not from LA, but I you know, everybody thinks that I am, but I'm not. But I recently visited LA. And I made it a point to visit a lot of the spots where the legendary rock figures and movie stars kind of hung out or lived or died. Totally. And I visited a couple of Morrison haunts, including the Laurel Canyon house. And, and oh my gosh, the history there. I mean, I can't imagine like being in that environment in the 60s when music was defined in that whole region. Oh my God. It's amazing.
I'm glad you say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that house, and you know, Sean and I went to that house. We had to, and I believe the owner was there. I think he was selling it at the time, but he let us like look, and he said, "Look, there's most of it's changed, but there's this bathroom, and there's still, you know, Morrison had written the Oedipal poem that he did in the end in nail polish for some reason on the tile of the shower, and he had preserved that." And look, I'm not going to. It was like, wow, you know, we felt something there, and it felt good. We didn't feel like we were taking something from Morrison by telling our own story, because we were trying to validate ourselves too. Don't get me wrong. Like, are we doing this? This is what we're doing. But beyond that, there is a vibe there that's, to me, positive and intense, and the whole scene is huge, and it's so hard to get away from it. And part of this film is, yes, me, you know, trying to come to terms with that, you know, that time, but not in the same way other films have done. Because in a sense, I'm sort of like, you know, that was sort of our father's movie, The Doors. That's Oliver Stone's generation, and technically, I'm be the son of that generation, and or the children of that generation. So I think it's our take, and it's sort of. I am excited by that age still in that time. It still resonates deeply, and even in Paris and in France. And, of course, we don't shy away what was happening in Paris at the time either. And that's important to me. You know, we really did some research and wanted to get into it a little more there. But you can't deny that time still in American history is just huge.
You bring up something interesting. What do you think, as part of your generation, looking back at this period of time, what do you think you perceive about that era that the people that lived in the thick of it can't see?
Wow, that's I think we see that social change is a lot harder than we thought. And that you're caught sometimes between, you know, what is action? Is it violence action? I'm thinking about just what happened recently, you know, in the Middle East and even here with Occupy. Is it, how does social change happen? Is it just through democratic elections? how vigilant should we be? And truthfully, part of this for this character is like, what is the role of the artist in that? What is the role of someone like Jim who said, fight, and the Doors even said, let's change your mind, man, let's fight the system, and yet say, whoa, we're not hippies either, take it easy. We're not political necessarily. We're trying to change your mind first. But in the end, you live in your time, and you have to make choices about who do you vote for. Everything about your life is defined by politics as well. So I think Jay and Jim are caught between the sense of like feeling above it all in a way suddenly, but then also still stuck in it. And our character's just as much scared of we have a trial impending as well, I admit, in our film. And I think that really would disturb Jim immensely, to have the FBI after him, to do anything they want. I mean, there are people getting assassinated, right and left in the leftist movement. And so I think for people like us, I think there's a confusion a little bit, like, can we change and how do we do it? But maybe that's the greatest lesson is like it takes a lot more work, and we should think a little bit more about what we do before we do it, even if we're passionate about change. And that means, violent action, which we explore as well, in the film with, a lot of what was going on in Paris. Because after 16 Paris, people were, the left, which certainly had many factions, were still fighting the cops, in the streets till like 74, I think. So.
Yeah. Do you think that the role of the artist has become a bit more challenging now? Because I look at the culture and I see a lot of fickleness and apathy. How does the artist find his place there?
It's true, and I feel like it's interesting. It depends. Like if you're a filmmaker, or I think an actor in film, I think we fight against this also, the sense of like that, you're in a pop culture, particularly in America, thing. So if you get serious for a second and have a stand politically, you kind of get your ass kicked a bit, unless maybe you're, I hate to say it, you're more status quo, And I think there's a fear actually of a lot of artists to take a stand, unless you're an independent artist, and there you are on the outside anyway, maybe like us. I think more artists I feel like people feel like they want to be more entertainers, Jamie, more than, wanting to change people's mind. And I think even, you mentioned LA, and I feel like when even great artists come out here, particularly filmmakers, it's so hard not to have the studio system, be part of what you do or strive for, because you want to eventually have better budgets, but still keep your integrity, as you say, or make your own films. But eventually it's hard. And I'm not saying you compromise. It's just suddenly everyone's talking about that and not about what we're talking about right now. They're not talking about what is the role of the artist, in today's society. How do you change the world? What are how do you do that now? I actually think there's a fear for most artists nowadays to do what Jim would have done, to write the way Jim would have written. And if they do, it's small, it's in their own notebooks, and it's hard to get out. It's so hard for cinema to be seen as well, I think, in America, to have that ability, Jamie, to be those kinds of films. It still has to be veiled as pop. American Hustle, it was great. It's a pop film, but I think there's a lot going on in there that people don't want to talk about either, And anyway, yeah.
Well, and I do think I love what you're saying, because I say it all the time. I think that all true artists, that should be their motivation, to change the world. I mean, why not? I mean, just grab a hold of it. But I see how film has changed, and I always talk about the films of the 70s, and people say, well, what made them so great? And they were so great because they actually engaged in the world around them, and in a way that movies today generally don't, unless you're looking in the independent realm of things. That's what I miss,
Well, I mean, that's absolutely the film Sean and I particularly just adore. And every film I've made somehow takes place in the 70s, even if it's modern day. Like Godspeed, there's no cell phones. I mean, it's clearly modern day, but it's not. And here we are finally, I think I'm confronting that period, head on. I finally saw, the Criterion edition of Easy Rider, and I was like, oh, my God, it just looks and sounds so good. And just the energy is still there. And we clearly, Sean and I are obsessed with those films. So this film is absolutely coming from that because of what you just said. They weren't afraid. They weren't afraid to confront both society, but beyond that, like Jim, personal demons, or just things we don't want to talk about, whether it's death or whatever. And, we're obsessed with those kinds of films, and so is our character, and so is our film as a whole, And I wish for more of those these days, Jamie. I do.
Yeah.
Those are the great ones,
Absolutely, man. And so that's why that's what's so great about crowdfunding and your project in particular, because all film lovers, all lovers of the types of films that we've been discussing, have an opportunity to kind of jump in the fight, and make these movies happen again. So, with that in mind, how do our listeners find your page to donate?
Yes, so we're on Indiegogo, and it's actually a pretty easy address. It's just igg.me/at/lastbeatmovie. So we're on Indiegogo. You can look up our name, The Last Beat. We're on Facebook. It's just The Last Beat Movie. And Twitter, Last Beat Movie. Last Beat Movie, basically.
And your website is lastbeatmovie.com is your website too?
It is actually, yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.